color too. This time, stories like the little bear who saved Christmas because someone had stolen the gifts and he found them. Or Elmo saves Christmas because a poor family didn't have a tree and Elmo got 'em for them, or the story of a bearded man who comes from the pole on Christmas night and comes down the chimney and leaves us gifts. All these stories and others like them are an attempt by the world to make up for the lack of color that this time of year has if you do not understand and receive the true story of Christmas. Because the true story of Christmas doesn't need any extra gloss, because it is glorious, because the truth is glorious. As Christians, we know who the glory of Christmas is. We know that Jesus is the glory of Christmas, and his story truly gives color and light to our lives. All this month we have been reviewing the glorious story of Christmas from different angles and characters. We already talked about the angels, the shepherds, Joseph and Mary, and today we have to talk about some enigmatic characters who find their only mention in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 2. 1-12. I am referring to the wise men of the East. Matthew 2, 1-2 says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea in the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? They asked. We saw his star rise from him and we have come to worship him. Our story places us in space and time and tells us that this happened after the birth of Jesus, in the time of King Herod and in the city of Jerusalem, capital of the kingdom of the Jews. It happened that some wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem. These are the enigmatic characters we were referring to. From all the illustrations and representations that we have seen, they seem very familiar to us and seem to fit into the picture, but the truth is that in the biblical story they have the opposite effect. The appearance of these people is most strange and unexpected. Who are these men? This is where tradition has filled the computer gap with many ideas that do not have biblical precision. For example, let's do a little test. 4 questions. How many were these men? What did they do? What were their names? When did you come to know Jesus? How many were these men? The answer is, we simply don't know. The Bible tells us that there was more than one. It says some wise men. But it doesn't tell us how many. Some people think there were 3 because they presented 3 gifts. Other traditions say that there were 2, 4, even 12 wise men. 704. What did they do? They are identified in the Bible as wise men. The Greek word is magi, like magicians, a word that we could probably translate as astrologer, or someone who studies the stars. They were scholars, students of the celestial bodies, and their signs came from the east, perhaps Persia or Arabia. Something is very clear to us. They were not kings, as they are traditionally known. Nor were they Jews. They were people from other nations or cultures different from the Jews, that is, in biblical terms, they were Gentiles. What are their names? Although you may very well be answering, Melchior, Gaspar and Balthazar, the biblical answer is that we do not know. Scripture does not provide us with that information. Not even that there were 3. When did you come to know Jesus? Perhaps guided by the illustrations of the birth, we might be thinking that it was the same night of the birth because we found him there next to the manger and accompanying the shepherds. But the biblical story places this story some time after the Nativity. Days or weeks had passed since the birth when they had that encounter with Jesus. How did you do on this exam? Be that as it may, what we must not lose sight of is that these men were scholars, scientists who came from other nations, who were not Jews or who did not live under the beliefs of the Old Testament, and, nevertheless, they arrived in Jerusalem with a disturbing question, which had made them travel many kilometers from the east to find the answer. His question was, where was the King of the Jews born? They had arrived in Jerusalem looking for an answer to his question, and that is why they had gone to Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish people. And they had a very well-defined purpose. We have followed his star and have come to worship him. This is incredible. These non-Jewish men had traveled from far away and came with a simple but firm purpose: we have come to worship him. Although in the illustrations of the birth these men look very appropriate for the scene, their presence is the strangest thing you could imagine. They don't fit reality. It's like seeing a man talking on a cell phone in a photo from World War II. You would say, something doesn't fit. And that's right, non-Jewish men were not supposed to be looking for the King of the Jews to worship him. But this is how God shows us his grace. These unexpected men represent all the people from all the nations of the world who are thousands of miles from Bethlehem, who have been called to worship the King of Kings who was born among the Jews. Because this is what God does. God calls unexpected people to his kingdom. The scripture already said it in Psalm 22. 27 All the earth will recognize the Lord and return to him, all the families of the nations will bow before him. Or Psalm 86, 9. All the nations you made will come and bow down to you, Lord. They will praise your holy name. 705. In the events that surrounded the story of the birth of Christ, representatives of all the nations of the earth could not be missing who have been insistently and decisively seeking the King to worship him. This is the reality of our King, because one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So that day, people unknown to the Jews were looking for the King of the Jews to worship him, because God calls unsuspected people into his kingdom. That day, the people in power were surprised and scared. It tells us that King Herod was troubled by this unexpected quest, and immediately he began to plan how to find this supposed king who was potentially coming to dethrone him. So he called together from among the people all the chief priests and teachers of the law, and asked them where the Christ was to be born. They answered him, that in Bethlehem of Judea, a small town that was about 8 kilometers from Jerusalem. And they repeated what the prophet had said hundreds of years before. Matthew 2, 6 But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a prince who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. There was no doubt, the King of Jews, the Christ must have been born in Bethlehem. Herod was 8 kilometers away and was not able to go look for him. The biblical scholars were just a few kilometers away and did not go looking for him. These enigmatic and unsuspected men were the only ones who were determinedly searching for the King born to worship him, because God calls unexpected people to his kingdom. Herod secretly called the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said to them, Go and find out about that child, and as soon as you find him, tell me so, that I too can go and worship him. Apparently Herod also wanted to worship him. He expressed it this way to the wise men, but it was all part of a plan to put an end to any threat against his hegemony. He wanted them to locate the child but not to worship him, but to annihilate him, which did not happen because the wise men were warned. In a dream of Herod's perverse purposes, the wise men continued on their way to Bethlehem, being guided by this astronomical phenomenon that specifically pointed them to the place where the child was. And when they arrived, the scripture tells us in Matthew 2:11, when they arrived at the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. They opened their chests and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Jesus was no longer in a manger, but in a house, and when they saw the child they prostrated themselves, that is, they bowed with their faces to the ground, and worshipped. And they presented their gifts, gold, frankincense and myrrh, gifts, for their cost, worthy of a king. 706. The men had reached the end of a long journey and had fulfilled their purpose. Coming from the ends of the world, they came to Bethlehem to worship the King who had been born. Full of joy, they worshipped him. That image is not understandable with the naked eye. It is not expected, but it was possible, because the God of grace calls unexpected people to his kingdom. Those who always had him close did not arrive, those who came from afar loved him. Paradoxes of the grace of our God. Christmas is glorious because it shows us the God of grace who does unexpected things, who brings his redemption in unexpected ways, and who calls people who do not deserve to be near him. The hope of the people was that a king would come, a shepherd who would lead God's people to freedom from him. The Christmas story shows us that the wise men found that king and worshipped him. They worshipped Jesus, the King of Israel, the Son of David, whose mission was to save the damned, the lost, the disabled, and he did so by taking our place. He lived the perfect life that we cannot live, and despite being righteous and holy, he carried a cross to Calvary, a cross